Hello, my name is Christian Wilson. Welcome to our webinar today on NetSuite ABR and Statement Direct. I understand that a few of you joining us won't have seen ABR before in any capacity, so I'll briefly start with a little introduction and then we'll go straight into the new features. Followed finally by a short demonstration of Statement Direct and an explanation as to what it is and why people use it. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is hop out of the presentation into NetSuite. Now, I'm basing this presentation on the understanding that everybody here has actually had some experience with NetSuite, or at least understands the interface. So apologies if you're not in that category, and I'm sure if you get in touch with us at the end of the webinar, we'll be able to help you along. This is, inside ABR, our reconciliation screen. Now, as you may know, NetSuite has limited functions when it comes to reconciling a bank statement. And what we have here is an environment where the user can see on the left-hand side, if I see this GL header, all of the transactions that are in my NetSuite GL for a given period, and all of the transactions that are in an imported bank statement, and then I can match them off left and right. Clearly these don't match, so it would actually allow me to create that match. I also have options to click on a transaction and create a GL transaction, so that's create a journal entry directly from my bank statement into NetSuite. If I scroll up to see all of the information at the top, I have information about the opening, outstanding, and net balances of my two accounts. That's the NetSuite account and the bank account. And what I'm going to do today is talk about some of the way that the features that we have involved in this system have changed and how they all tie together. So let's just hop back into the presentation. Okay, so based on the feedback that we've received from our customers, we've made a number of changes, and also a number of changes that we feel were necessary that enable it to be rolled out across a wider audience, and there have been a couple of what we would maybe call fixes as well. So let's look at our first piece of feedback. People say, when will we be able to auto-generate payments as well as journal entries, and how will the payments be allocated? So this is a feature that we've been meaning to add since we launched the product, but it's taken some time to get there. But what I can tell you now is we're actually in a place where we can now allow users to create customer payments as part of the auto-gen procedure and allocate them against the transactions in NetSuite. So how does that work? Now, if you're familiar with our Autogenerate template, so that's a template that allows us to automatically create transactions off the back of journal entries that we import. I'll show you a couple of new fields that have been added there. So we're on the Autogen template record, and instead of choosing the posting type journal entry, which we used to be forced to choose, we now have this option for payment. Secondly, we can turn on this enable auto allocation and actually use any of the 4 allocation methods available in the drop down below. So oldest transaction first, the payment's allocated against the newest first. Maybe it matches using the reference, or maybe it's just done purely by the amount. And finally, we can either, in the template, decide which entity it's going to be attached to by selecting the entity name from the first drop down. Alternatively, we could choose an entity type. Is that a customer? Is it a vendor? We can choose an entity field ID. So on the entity record, what the ID of the field which we want to match. A search option. So a search option would be contains or exactly matches or begins with. And then finally, an expression. And using this expression, we can actually take the reference text from our imported bank statement and find the customer or entity that payment is actually related to. Let's hop back into NetSuite. So here I've got an Autogenerate template example already loaded up. Now what I want to do is I want to look at the sample reference which I'm going to give. So the Vodafone 1234 state 1234 5678. This is the reference line from my bank statement, and I want NetSuite to automatically identify Vodafone as the entity that it needs to create the posting against. And I also want to change the reference to remove the 1234 because perhaps that's sensitive information. So the first thing I do is I enter this entity expression. Now what does this do? The first part, the ref before the column, that's telling me that I'm looking at the reference line of the bank statement. The 1 tells me the character to begin with, and the 8 tells me for how many characters should it pay attention. So that's the first 8 characters of this sample reference. Now the idea of the sample reference here is just that I can put in the information from my bank statement as an example, and I can see NetSuite down here in the entity search result field actually automatically picking up that the entity expression given is Vodafone, first 8 characters of my sample reference, and selecting the entity Vodafone Inc. because it knows that that is the entity that starts with the first 8 characters here. You'll notice I've used the starts with search option, and I've used the entity ID internal field, but you could use your own custom field if you wanted to. Perhaps that your entities are all numbered and you'd like to use the numbers that you've set up for your entities that are inside the reference from your bank statement. That's all well and good, but there's something further we can do here as well. We can actually begin to use the reference text, so the Vodafone 12345678 from our bank statement, and change that into the memo text that's going to be entered against the transaction within NetSuite. So I'm going to write in here payment colon. Now this is just text, or I don't even have to use the colon. XXX, because I don't want the transaction in NetSuite to reflect that sensitive information that's on my reference. And then I'm going to do the curly brackets that we've seen before, using the ref for the reference text that we've discussed, this Vodafone 12345678, and then I'm going to use field 10 as the first field, and for how many fields am I paying attention? It's going to be 4. Close curly brackets. And now we can see down here, memo expression result. That's telling me if Vodafone 12345678 matched the criteria in my auto-generate template, what expression or what would the memo on the NetSuite transaction look like? And the answer is it would be payment, 4 X's, and then the final 4 characters from the reference. So this is just a cool new feature that we can use to create payments within NetSuite. And actually this memo expression will also work with journal entries as well. So we're actually using the reference text and breaking that down and using that information to change the behavior of the NetSuite system through Autogenerate. Now, again, for the people who haven't actually seen the Autogenerate template in action, let's go back to the reconcile window. Before I showed you the option to choose a transaction, or maybe multiple transactions at once, and I can click on this create GL transaction option, and that will create a journal entry for this amount inside NetSuite so it can match against the bank statement. But alternatively, using an auto-generate template, I could have preset that up, and at the time that I enter the NetSuite reconciliation page, I can click on auto-generate. It will run through my rules, my auto-generate rules, find templates that match transactions in my bank statement that maybe I know are going to come up but I don't have NetSuite transactions for, and automatically creates a whole heap of transactions within NetSuite that match those. So already things like bank charges, phone bills, etc. that I know are coming are automatically going to be created in NetSuite, ready to reconcile. In fact, it will automatically match them and put them into my match display. If I change this to match, it would show me only the transactions that have already been matched. Again, I'm really hoping to talk almost exclusively about the new features. So I don't want to go into too much detail about how the system works already, but just to give you a little bit of background information. Let's hop back into the presentation. So what other feedback have we got? When we create a GL transaction, so that's the journal entry, directly from the reconcile window, we're limited to 79 lines. Okay, I can see that being an issue. So a lot of our customers will typically only create 1-line GL entry. So that's, and by 1 line, clearly I mean a 2-line journal entry where the first line is the line on the bank statement. So what have we done about that? The number of lines the user is able to create has been extended. Now, currently we're unaware of any actual limit to the number of lines you can enter against a transaction, but we suggest no more than 1,000 lines for a number of reasons. One, it could take a long time to enter those lines, and if you lose your internet connection to NetSuite, well, perhaps you could lose it. But from a programming perspective, I don't think there's any limit, or we're not aware of a limit just now. Where is that, you ask? If I go back into NetSuite, I click on this Create GL transaction. With my first transaction on the bank statement checked, it opens this transaction entry window. It takes the amount for my current account, because that's the account that I'm reconciling, and it allows me to choose another account for my total accounts. Now, this isn't a real example, but I could then create a journal entry straight off the back of this, and I can do this over multiple lines. So I add this, and then I could maybe add 7p credit towards another account. Okay, so now we're unlimited lines, no longer limited to 79. Let's leave that without creating a journal entry. Back to the presentation. The third piece of feedback. Can we have a warning when we're editing a journal entry which has been reconciled? That's a good question. It can be frustrating if a journal entry has been reconciled, and previously we had no warning that would tell the user whether or not a journal entry that they're viewing or trying to edit had already been reconciled. So what could we do about that? A pop-up error message. Perfect. This transaction has been reconciled against a bank statement. Any changes to this record may affect the bank reconcile. Now, this is a great pop-up, and there's no extra control over this, so be warned that it is just a warning. It won't prevent you from changing it. It will just tell you that doing this may affect the reconciliation. I'll allow it to go down a little, and then I can put this line here. So a warning system is now put in place. Now, we are planning to extend this across all transaction types, or all supported transaction types that we utilize in our ABR product. But currently, it's only journal entries that will present this warning if you try to edit them when they have already been reconciled. Okay. Piece of feedback number 4. Can we hide the filter section at the top of the reconcile screen? So let's go back to the window. Now I'm in an environment here where actually this has been updated. So this is the new version, but we used to have a huge amount of filters and fields that we could use here to cut down the transaction. So if you had a 10,000 line extraction and a 10,000 line bank statement to match, it might have been very tricky to wade through all that data. So we could cut it down using all kinds of filters: department, class, entity name, reference. And what we've done now is we've condensed that into one filter. So it comes up in a pop-up window. I enter my filter information, transaction type, memo, match number, entity name, and using this, it will cut down the list underneath down here. But to declutter this initial reconciliation screen that's been removed. We've also very slightly shifted the fields. The order remains the same, but the fields have been very slightly shifted so that the entire screen now fits more neatly within the window. Now I'm using a fairly low resolution laptop screen, but to give you just some idea of how that might look, this is what it would look like typically on my larger full HD screen that I use day to day for my work. Okay, now I have included a couple of screenshots in the presentation, and that's purely because if you'd like to download the presentation afterwards, I'd like you to remember what exactly that looks like. Okay, so there are four of, I suppose, the key features that we've added to ABR. Let's take a look at some of the others. Number 1, so the automatch can now access transactions that meet criteria that fall outside the statement dates. This was a big one for us. If you imagine we have an auto match rule that says if the date is within 2 days of the transaction in the bank statement and the values match and the reference is the same, then match those automatically. But an issue that we came up against was, what if it meets the criteria, but the transaction that's within 2 days of the bank statement transaction falls outside of our reconcile window? Let's say it's the last day of January, but you're reconciling February. And what it would actually do is match that transaction, but you wouldn't be able to see it because it was not within the reconcile window. So now it behaves correctly and allows you to see that match has taken place, even if it's picking up from outside the window. And of course, you have to confirm that match before the reconcile is complete. Okay. Transactions cannot be extracted if the date falls before the opening position date. So I suppose this was it was never considered when we were initially building ABR. But what we've done now is given you that extra safeguard just to make sure that you can't accidentally choose dates that are before the opening position of the bank statement for the bank account within NetSuite. Autogenerate can now post multiple GL entries from one statement line. So this is a new feature. So if you had an example where you had one charge on your bank account, you wanted to post that set 2 ways within NetSuite, maybe with 2 references, or maybe even 2 separate accounts, we now have the capacity to do so. So you can now say, I know I'm going to get the £27 charge, but I want that to post that as one transaction for 20 and a separate transaction for 7. Okay, and finally, rerunning the extraction will now update the memo field. So what you may be familiar with if you've used ABR is that if you perform an extraction to get a snapshot of all your GL transactions within NetSuite, and then you rerun the extraction, it tells you how many of the transactions, there may be 400 are extracted, and now having done the second extraction, there are now 400 which already existed, 20 of those are updated, and there are 20 new transactions. Now that update was updating values and it was updating classification, but what it didn't do before was non-GL changes to a transaction. What it does now do is update that memo. So if you put a journal entry in, just as an example, and the memo said one thing. You rerun that extraction, it would update the snapshot, the extracted snapshot, with a new memo. So it's just a small change, but it's been requested, and it's quite helpful, I think, for the people that rely on the memo within NetSuite for the auto match or for the auto gen. Okay, so I've got a couple more things to say before we start putting this to questions. Excuse me if I get back to NetSuite. To start, what is Statement Direct, and why do we talk about Statement Direct? So perhaps you now have an understanding, if you haven't seen ABR before, of what ABR does. We have these options to import the bank account statement. On the left-hand side, extract, let's take a snapshot of NetSuite and list all the transactions in the view so we can match them left and right. We have these options for auto-generate, which we've talked about maybe rather extensively today, where we can create GL transactions based on criteria that we outline, looking at the bank statement and making sure that those transactions exist in the NetSuite. Auto match, so if you have 40 or 50 transactions that you have every month, and you can create a rule that says, oh, we know the transaction's coming, it's the same vendor, does the reference say 35, is the value for between 100 and 200, is the date within 1 or 2, it will automatically match the transactions left and right, so you only have to reconcile a very few transactions at the end. But what Statement Direct does is take this one step further. And the environment, or I suppose the UI, has slightly changed. If anybody's familiar with Statement Direct, they won't recognize this screen. We now have an option. So we're choosing the ABR, the NetSuite accounts we want to reconcile. So typically, you'd have maybe 20 or 30, but in this environment, I have 3. The dates I want to reconcile them between. And also, I can do these tasks automatically. So I can say, instead of importing the statement from a file that I've downloaded from my online banking tool, what I'm able to do is click download statement from this task at the top, this task section at the top here, and it automatically connects to my bank account and downloads the data directly from the bank. Now, one small point here I have to make is that unlike the import process, when you can configure the way that NetSuite understands the import of your data from your bank, the download statement tool uses a service which we're connected to, which limits the banks that we can support the Statement Direct for. So not all banks will support us directly downloading the statements from them. Secondly, we can choose the extract transaction task. Now what this does, I've talked about a snapshot of transactions, so if I go into a little bit more detail there, it takes a list of the transactions that hit your GL within NetSuite and presents them in a list to compare to the statement. Now you might ask why that would happen. Let's take 2 examples. The first would be if I'm in an environment where the system's constantly changing and I need just a solid snapshot I can compare the reconcile to before I sign it off. I can make sure that things aren't going to change. Now, I'm not talking about values. I'm talking about people accessing the transactions and just changing memos, although we have talked about memo updating, but changing non-GL transaction information. And secondly, the snapshot just allows the system to run just that little bit faster, so it doesn't have to continually research through all 10,000 transactions against the bank account in 1 month or 1 day that you maybe have your reconcile set to. So it just filters the information out to the information that it needs in order to reconcile as quickly and slickly as possible. We can also select auto match and auto generate. So rather than going into that reconcile bank statement environment, if I click onto this tab here, having to click auto match and going through my rules and making sure the transactions match left to right, auto generate, it will actually do those for me and just bring up a page of unmatched transactions. So we have customers that use the system with thousands of transactions, but they're all expected. And what they're able to do is, using Statement Direct, click one button, import the bank statement, take a snapshot of the NetSuite transactions, compare them, auto-match them. So 90% of the transactions are already auto-matched because they know. Maybe 10 or 9% of the transactions are generated charges they're expecting, things they don't track within NetSuite, but they want to once they know what their values are. And then finally, they have 1% of the transactions remaining for them to click left and right and make sure that those transactions line up side by side. So using this ABR Statement Direct and then perform tasks, and it would go off and do exactly that and take me through to the ABR reconcile window, accessible by the way through the ABR tab, reconcile bank statement, and that would take me to this reconcile page. For the users who don't use ABR, I can actually revisit this page at any time. So if I've matched a few transactions and I go back and I start looking at something else, my boss comes in and asks me to take a look at maybe a specific transaction somewhere else, I can leave this page confident that I can come back and find this reconcile bank statement page in exactly the same state. So I go back to ABR, reconcile bank statement, open a new tab, and I could select my bank account that I was reconciling just before. So the NatWest current account, click reconcile, and it would be in exactly the same state as it is here. Now what I'd like to do now is open up the webinar for questions. Now in the past, we haven't had so many people on the webinars, so today I'll wait just a little time. I'm going to mute myself briefly, and if you have any questions, please throw them into the comments section below. Now, if you also have any questions that maybe you don't want to take to the webinar, you don't want in front of the audience, you can always reach our sales team at sales@nolanbusinesssolutions.com at the bottom of this presentation. Alternatively, you can get in touch with your account manager if you're already one of our customers, and I'll be more than delighted to send you a copy of this presentation. I'll give you any information that you'd like to have about ABR. Okay.